women, preachers and Methodists. So welcome to everyone and welcome to the editors. John, I believe you're going to start us off.
Thank you, Tim. And thank you everybody else at Englesea, Brook, particularly you, Ruth, for enabling this launch. We are hoping to have a physical launch later on at Oxford. And if you want to be able to go to that, then do contact me to find out when it's going to be. I can be contacted at librarian@wesleyhistoricalsociety.org.uk, and I think Ruth is going to, or Tim are going to put that on the screen at some point. I've been asked partly to start because one of the questions was, how did the book begin? And in August 2018, there was the Oxford Methodist Institute, which had scholars from all over the world. And I was in a group of 20 historians, half Americans, with one other Brit, Tim Woolley. I've been working on Methodist women preachers for over 20 years, and I gave a paper on the woman preacher Mary Taft. This was later printed in the WHS proceedings. At the end of the paper, there was a response and then a discussion. And afterwards, I asked the others a question. What should I tackle next? And the reply came from Tim Woolley. Organize a conference on Methodist women preachers and publish the resulting papers. And the result is the book which you see. Tim, unsurprisingly, is one of the contributors. There is, of course, a little more to tell. In late autumn 2018, I started ringing a few friends who were experts on women preachers and seeing if they were interested. By the new year, I had enough names committed and asked Clive Norris, as the WHS conferences secretary with experience in this field, to help, and he agreed. We then went to the Oxford Centre for Methodism and Church History at Oxford Brookes. And Professor Bill Gibson there, who's already been mentioned, was very supportive, but thought we were suggesting a theme for a Saturday day seminar of the kind which they do regularly. I said we had enough speakers for 2 days and needed overnight accommodation. They accepted the new idea and agreed to host the conference called An Extraordinary Call on a Friday and Saturday in November 2019 and put on an exhibition. Meanwhile, we had the good news that the Susanna Wesley Foundation was willing to sponsor the conference and provide a generous sum of money to organize it and to publish the results. And Clive had also persuaded Michaela Youngson, at that time president of the conference, but by November, of course, ex-president, to come and speak. Later, we also secured funding from the World Methodist Historical Society and the Wesley Historical Society. There was a problem with overnight accommodation. It became clear that in term time, OBU could not provide it. Bill came up with an answer: make the conference free and ask everyone to organize their own accommodation. Wesley Mem agreed to approach members to provide some hospitality in aid of their building fund. Dinner on the Friday was to be paid for separately by those who wanted it. We sent off flyers in April asking for other volunteers as speakers, and David Bundy and one other responded. We'd expected about 30 or 40 participants. Then in August, Methodist Church House sent out our flyer, and suddenly everything changed. We'd put a closure date of early October for registration. In September, we had more than 60 and looking at moving to a larger hall. We had to put a cap on registration at 80. At least 30 people had to be turned away. The conference itself went very well, though it was wet and cold outside. Afterwards, we considered how to make the proposed book a reality. The Oxford Centre offered to publish the book, which would be cheapest, and Daniel Reid, also here today, agreed to deal with that side once we had a manuscript. There had been the earlier successful conference on Susanna Wesley, The Bright Succession, organised by Methodist Heritage at Lincoln University in the summer of 2019. We'd offered to publish papers from it. With OBU, we knew we needed another editor to help us, preferably someone who'd given a paper at Lincoln. and Linda Ryan, with a research interest in gender issues, was happy to assist. So in March last year, the three of us started work on securing print versions with notes, if possible, from our speakers, including 4 from the Lincoln Conference, a process which went on until September. Christine Jones, also here today, indexer for the proceedings, agreed to tackle this rather large work. I now hand over to Linda to describe something of what's in it.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. One of the deliberate themes that resonates throughout Women Preachers Methodists is the question of gender. It's all too easy to look at Methodist history through a 21st century lens and argue that women were excluded from leadership roles, often silenced and frequently sidelined. As our volume testifies, however, the truth is much more nuanced than that. By examining the lives of our female Methodist forebears and positioning their thoughts and actions within the context of the times in which they lived, Women Preachers Methodists provides a thought-provoking reflection on pioneers of Methodist history across the centuries. As John Lenton states in the introduction to the volume, Methodism was sympathetic to women and to what was seen as women's concerns and temperament. The ideas behind Methodism and the intellectual independence of women like Susanna Wesley or Mary Bosanquet-Fletcher gave Methodist women strength to seek ways of leading, encouraging, and opening ways for spiritual growth, similar to those they could see lay men pursuing. Celebrating the 350th anniversary of Susanna Wesley's birth in 1669, the opening 4 chapters of Women Preachers Methodists consider Susanna the woman as wife, mother, educator, household manager, thinker, letter writer, author, and preacher. Susanna was well educated, well read, and not afraid to hold an opinion. A strong woman who Charles Wesley describes as much edgier than the sweet caricature of mother come primary teacher. Wallace adds that her faith was a lived religion built on lifelong learning and lifelong teaching. She was a practical theologian at work in a teaching ministry. Bill Gibson reflects on the 18th century view that a happy marriage involved the wife being subservient to her husband and compliant in the pleasures of the marriage bed. While Susanna's 19 pregnancies might suggest that this was the case, there is little doubt that she did not abandon her opinions or acquiesce to all of Samuel Wesley's demands. Susanna's prayer meetings, held in the family's kitchen at Epworth, and her strongly held political views were a frequent cause for disharmony and confounded the view that all 18th century wives relinquished their independence of thought or action on their marriage. Nevertheless, while Susanna's own education and that of her daughters may have been unusual for the time, they still conformed to the gender constraints of the period. While girls might be encouraged to read edifying texts such as religious and moral treatises, the acquisition of such literature usually meant that only those from wealthier households could acquire such knowledge. Class and gender boundaries largely define the sort of education women received. Boys and girls were not considered educational equals. Despite this, John Wesley's upbringing at Epworth had taught him the value of women as agents for hosting prayer meetings, organising societies, and even exhorting and preaching. In the first period of Methodism, up to 1760, such women were few and were often frowned on by the male leadership for usurping the authority of men. However, Mary Bosanquet's argument for the extraordinary call of women to preach on the same grounds as men swayed opinion. And as the Methodist movement developed, the number of women of sufficient ability and experience to preach grew within it. What then are the experiences of such women? Chapters 5 to 11 look at Methodist women preachers in the 18th and 19th centuries. Erin White points to the position in Wales when the success of Calvinist Methodism with their conservative view of women resulted in leadership roles almost exclusively being filled by men. Elizabeth Thomas and Jane Owens are, however, among those highlighted by White as having been stirred up to preach. Thomas came from a wealthy family and is described as having a good level of education and self-confidence. Owens, on the other hand, was probably educated through the charity circulating schools, where emphasis was placed not just on proving literacy, but ensuring salvation through teaching pupils to read the Bible. While White suggests many Methodist women hosted preachers in their homes, she argues that it is something of a stereotype to assume women were merely providers of hospitality. There were other more spiritual outlets for their energies and talents, including hymn writing, where their voices were more easily detected. John Lenton comments that for women, the call to preach is less well documented. Methodist women were often determined to write about their experiences in order to encourage others, but this was usually edited out by men who controlled publishing. While some women, including Mary Fletcher, were wealthy in their own right, others had no financial resources and were completely dependent on their hosts as they travelled from circuit to circuit. Marriage to a male preacher might therefore offer not only financial support, but access to the pulpit. Within Primitive Methodism, not only was there opposition to women preaching, but Tim McQueen suggests a deafening silence of the women themselves in the official records of the day. Nevertheless, Sarah Kirkland was among the travelling preachers who attracted thousands to camp meetings. By contrast, within the Bible Christian movement, women were regularly deployed as ministers, and their core doctrinal statement being, "We believe that God calls women as well as men to publish salvation to their fellow creatures." Bible Christian itinerant preachers, men and women, were paid by the circuit in which they were stationed. The women's pay, however, was a pittance, and half that of their male colleagues. Colin Short also notes that implicit in the rules was the fact that although women might be permitted to preach, men would always govern the movement. Women preachers in the second half of the 19th century faced many difficulties. Most men wanted a pliable, docile wife who would not jeopardise their husband's position through unorthodox behaviour. David Bundy, in reflecting on the radical holiness movement, examines the life of Catherine Stephen Smith and the practice of women speaking almost exclusively to women. While Catherine led confirmation classes for significant numbers and spoke at women's meetings, this was only in her husband's circuit, but David concludes, when her husband heard her preach, he was proud. Tim Woolley examines American Phoebe Palmer's visit to Britain between 1859 and 1863. Palmer argued that it was not so much a right, but a responsibility of women to teach and preach in church. Woolley argues that when she died in 1874, Palmer was probably the most famous Methodist woman of the 19th century. But her adaptations to the theology of entire sanctification were controversial, and she was, Woolley claims, soon all but forgotten. Jill Barber opens her chapter on female primitive Methodist preachers by declaring that the fate of female preachers is a terrible warning that freedoms can be lost as well as won. As missionaries, speaking in cottages or the open air, women proved highly successful, but as the focus moved to ministering to the converted rather than making new converts, female evangelists became increasingly seen as surplus to requirements. While it was acceptable for a female itinerant preacher to lodge with a local family, it was quite a different matter for her to become a householder in a manse, especially if she was young and single. At a time when Methodists increasingly wanted to show their loyalty to the government, female preaching was regarded as disruptive. By the end of the 19th century, attitudes had hardened against married women having any preaching role at all. To survive, female preachers had to prove not just that they were as good as men, but that they were better. Lack of self-confidence led many women to accept their role, not in the pulpit, but pouring tea. How then does the legacy of these pioneering women influence Methodist preachers today? Reflections from female presbyters in the closing chapters of Women Preachers Methodists conclude that whether invited to take up positions in ministry as a result of positive discrimination or not, having women ministers allows the whole human race, not just half of it, to be represented. The Methodist Church, both in its membership and in its congregations as a whole, has always been more female than male, and it is right that its ordained ministry should reflect this. Some opponents of equal ministry of women in the church have blamed the feminist movement for changing the doctrine and practice of churches. However, women have proved their calibre in 2 world wars. A lot has changed since women were first ordained as presbyters in the Methodist Church in 1971. There have now been 6 women presidents and numerous visible role models for aspiring women to look up to within Methodism, each bringing their own style and particular way of doing things. The culture of the Methodist Church has not yet changed enough. In all areas of equality, diversity, and inclusion, there is still work to do. Nonetheless, the faith struggles, laughter, faithfulness, insights, frustrations, compassion, doggedness, imagination, and leadership recorded within the pages of Women Preachers Methodists will inspire others into the bright succession. I'll now hand over to Clive to tell you a little more. I'm also going to put in the chat box the Amazon link to Women Preachers Methodists, should you wish to purchase a copy. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. I'm going to cover similar ground to Linda and take you quickly through the various chapters of the book, but I'm going to focus on the new material which you can find in the book, and I'll quote from the book itself wherever I can. One of its joys to me is the sheer variety of the voices with which our authors speak, and even more so the women's voices from the past that we can hear, sometimes for the first time. In the first 2 chapters, both Charlie Wallace and Bill Gibson build on recently discovered new manuscript sources to change our understanding of Susanna Wesley herself. Thus, Wallace quotes a letter of the 2nd of August, 1725, in which Susanna shared with her husband her frustration at the wild behaviour of their daughter Hetty, then in her late 20s. I quote, "We should be very easy to part with her, being quite tired out with her very licentious and scandalous adventures," Susanna told John, and many parents must have felt the same. The next chapter by Bill Gibson warns us in its very title, Susanna Wesley's Political Marriage, against reducing the past to neat compartments, in which we might study religious history or church history, while others focus on economic or political topics. As he explains, drawing on again previously overlooked primary sources, the marriage of Samuel and Susanna was intensely political. Even their wedding date, Gibson suggests, was chosen on political grounds. William of Orange had just landed at Torbay, intent on overthrowing James II, the king to whom they had both sworn allegiance. The chapter draws for the first time on some of her correspondence with the Reverend George Hicks, which Gibson has rediscovered in the Lambeth Palace Library. Moving on to chapter 5, Erin White offers a fascinating account of a much neglected cohort, the Methodist women preachers of 18th century Wales. And amongst these, she salutes Elizabeth Thomas of Blaine Porth in South Cardiganshire, who may well be the first Methodist woman preacher ever anywhere. She describes how Harold Harris, one of the pioneer leaders of Welsh Methodism, visited a small Methodist society meeting in a farmhouse called Cwm Harni on the 29th of April, 1741. And according to Harris's diary, I quote, "I find some do meet, but ye men not being gifted, a poor, humble, experienced, loving, broken soul, a woman, is stirred up to speak." Elizabeth Thomas was, after Susanna Wesley, possibly the first in this bright succession of women preachers, which our book celebrates. Chapter 7 by Tim McQuibbin is another contribution grounded in previously unpublished primary sources. In this case, material of special interest, as it is written by women preachers from the Primitive Methodist tradition. McQuibbin, like Colin Short, in discussing Bible Christian preachers in the following chapter, suggests that women preachers were especially valued because they, in the early prophetic phase of revivals, before the work of the Spirit became embedded in an institutional church. But both McQuibbin and Short demonstrate how male-dominated hierarchies struggled to find a place for women in these institutions. And McQuibbin explains that by 1818, around 20% of Primitive Methodist preachers were women, but this was controversial. When in 1827, the conference asked all its preachers to send in returns detailing their careers to date, the language of the minute was entirely directed towards males. As Elizabeth Allen noted in her response, I quote, "Looking at the minutes of the last conference held at Manchester, I find that each preacher is requested to give an account where he has travelled. But as the female preachers are not mentioned in this minute, I did not know whether it was my duty to write or not." And Colin Short notes with regret the demeaning practice amongst Bible Christians at this time, whereby, quoting him, women sent as pioneer evangelists had their role supplanted by a man sent to take over the work. Our book also contains 2 chapters on women preachers in the holiness tradition, one well known and one less so. In chapter 10, Tim Woolley writes about Phoebe Palmer, the American evangelist who visited Britain in the mid-19th century, whose confidence comes as quite a jolt to the reader. As Linda's mentioned, Phoebe had the temerity to assert, not that women had the right to teach and preach in church, but the duty. In her book, Promise of the Father, published in 1859, just before she came here, she based her claim firmly on scripture, and I quote her, "We wish to state unequivocally that in a scriptural sense, we believe all Christ's disciples, whether male or female, should covet to be endued with the gift of prophecy. Then will they proclaim, or in other words, preach Christ crucified, as far as in them lies, under all possible circumstances." In the preceding chapter, David Bundy talks about the hitherto largely overlooked radical holiness preacher, Catherine Stevens Smith. And as Linda has said, she was an example of a little-known phenomenon of women ministering primarily to other women. And Bundy shows how she overcame the strong Victorian prejudice in favor of women confining themselves to the so-called domestic sphere. But the picture that Bundy paints is complicated because Catherine did not fully escape from these restrictions. As he explains, her husband was supportive of her effort to cross the boundaries, but as clearly felt constrained by them. The final historical chapter in our book, chapter 11 by Jill Barber, draws on a wide range of sources to show the depth of the obstacles faced by Primitive Methodist women preachers in the 19th century. I was particularly struck by her account of 6 papers written by various men for an 1885 symposium on the position of woman in the church. In one paper, James Macpherson argued that the words apostle, prophet, and teacher were all masculine nouns in Greek, whereas helper was feminine, thus defining women's secondary role. Our book concludes with 3 personal reflections from contemporary women Methodist leaders, Christina Lemoynion, Judith Maisel-Long, who's here today, and Michaela Youngson. These are case studies of struggle. To a historian, they are primary sources, and they offer rich material for historians to quarry in documenting the attitudes both of women ministers and of the church and society within which they worked. As Christina Lemoynion comments, I quote, "For me, being a woman was nothing amazing. I shared that characteristic with half the human race. What was extraordinary was the call to be a minister. By contrast, most other people saw nothing very extraordinary about ministers, but the idea of a woman being a minister was unfamiliar, to say the least. All three are hopeful, but not blind to the challenges which remain. Indeed, our book shows that women have never been completely silenced in the history of Methodism, and suggests that their voices now are perhaps stronger than they've ever been since the time of Susanna Wesley herself. But the situation is still fragile, and there are many other groups and individuals within the church family and wider society whose voices still go unheard. And with that, I'll pass back to John with a few concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very quickly, I notice there's been a question in the chat about buying from Amazon. I'm afraid we had a difficult choice early on as to what we did about publication. Were we to go cheap through Amazon or were we to go elsewhere, in which case it would be more expensive and it would be difficult to buy, quite frankly. We knew we were going to have quite a lot of pages. We finished up with 390 pages, so that at $13.99 from Amazon, that has got to be good value. But I'm sorry that this choice had to be made, and we made it the way we did. There is one possible alternative. There are free copies, not many, a few, going to each of the 4 sites. Of course, you can buy it from the sites, and they will buy further copies doubtless from Amazon, and they can charge their own price and make more of a profit if you want to buy from them. I want to finish by saying something about role models. As a child, I was blessed so far as role models were concerned. I had 2 parents who were both good preachers. I think of them as preaching with the head, my father, and the heart, my mother. I became a preacher too and tried to combine both aspects. Role models are what male preachers have in abundance, women preachers have often lacked. From Moses via Isaiah and the 12 apostles through Luther, Wesley, Hugh Bourne, and on to Leslie Griffiths, Christian male role models seem to have multiplied exponentially. Female role models like Ruth, Esther, Mary Magdalene, Hilda, Julian of Norwich, Elizabeth Thomas, Elizabeth Bultitude, Lily Edwards, Pauline Webb, and others have been there, but have seemed much rarer and are much less famous and less quoted. They are rarely as celebrated as they should be, often difficult to find out about. Only 2 of those Methodist ones in that list I've just quoted out of 4 have made it so far into the Dictionary of Methodism. Both the foreword by Priscilla Pope Levison at the beginning of the book and the last chapter by Michaela Youngson at the end make this point much better than I'm doing now. So read both. If Women Preachers Methodists encourages us to discover more about our foremothers in the gospel, it will have fulfilled its purpose. I challenge all fellow Methodist preachers in 2021, whether in Britain or around the world, to use at least as many female examples in their sermons as they do male. You'll find some possibilities in the book. Thank you.